On the rubble of her home, she cries out for her parents. But the voices are gone, she cannot understand. She's confused, she's alone. There is blood on her hands, but it's not her fault. Not her fight, not her war. She's too young to give up, but it's not her fault.
A very warm welcome to you. My name is Amina Taylor, and this is Remember Palestine. On this show, we advocate for the Palestinians in the occupied territories and in the wider diaspora. Coming up on this edition of the show, many of us, myself included, would be hard-pressed to say protocol on conformity assessment and acceptance of industrial products, or in fact give a full account of what this is and what it does. Well, for the uninitiated, this EU-Israeli agreement removes barriers to trade, cuts red tape, and gets Israeli pharmaceutical products to the EU marketplaces more speedily. This agreement was opposed by those who said it would reward Israel for flouting international laws. The EU Parliament disagreed, and now pharmaceutical goods produced in Israel have an easier path to European marketplaces. This, the fear is, opens the door to other products receiving similar treatments. All this set against the backdrop of extremist settler activities in the West Bank. We'll have some more on this controversial EU-Israeli agreement later on in the show. But first, Hannah Cassis reports from the West Bank, where there's been an increase in attacks on Palestinians by extremist settlers.
According to Oxfam, the 2012 olive harvest kicked off with close to 900 trees lost to settler violence and vandalism in the first week alone. Palestinian as well as Israeli human rights organizations have reported that numerous Palestinians were injured by these settler attacks.
The settlers attacked a shepherd while herding his sheep, as well as his relatives who were picking olives nearby. We got word of this attack and went to protect them. As soon as they saw us coming, the settlers threw stones at us. I was hit in the head. Other guys from our village threw rocks back at them, and then Israeli forces started shooting at us.
According to the Islamic Christian Commission for the Defense of Jerusalem and the Holy Sites, Israeli settlers have vandalized 5 churches and over 10 mosques so far in 2012. The Commission fears that settler violence will violate more places of worship before the year comes to an end.
The settlers are now a nation inside of Israel. They are the ones who rule over the West Bank. They cut down the trees. They are the ones who prevent the farmers from reaching their trees during the olive season. They set the wheat fields on fire during harvest season. They close the streets, and they're the ones who prevent children from reaching their schools.
The latest information obtained by the Commission reveals that settlers as well as Israeli forces have used new methods to ruin Palestinian agriculture as well as harm the Palestinian population in the West Bank.
They place wild boars in our country. The wild boars eat or destroy everything planted in the land. They scare the villagers and prevent them from leaving their houses at night. The wild boars are very dangerous. They also set hyenas in our areas, and now they are putting poisonous snakes all over Palestine. This is what our people have discovered.
When asked about the possibility of peace in the Holy Land, Father Manuel responded,
Israel wants Palestine. Israel wants Palestine from the river to the sea. Peace, as long as Israel is concerned, is secondary, very secondary.
Palestinians are convinced now more than ever that as long as Israeli settlers roam their land, that neither humans, trees, nor places of worship are safe from settler violence. For Remember Palestine, Hannah Cassis, Occupied Birzeit.
From vandalism of holy sites to the constant settler attacks on Palestinians and the seeming lack of any real progress on the quest for peace, has anything really changed for Palestinians? Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Jamal Juma. He's the coordinator of Stop the Wall campaign, on the line from Ramallah. Good to speak to you, Mr. Juma. Has anything changed since 2002 when the wall was erected?
Yes, since 2002, everything has changed here. Israel was able to change the whole geopolitical map of the West Bank. What you were saying 2002, you didn't see it now. Now you see in 800 kilometers of walls, like besieging the Palestinians in 40% of their land in the West Bank, while the war launched on the Palestinian people's life now in what's so-called Area C, that Israel want to annex by this wall. One in what they called it the strategic plan for Israel 2020, which has been declared in Herzliya conference, which is now almost in a year time for the implementation of this plan. The situation now of the Palestinian life in all aspects is different. Now there is checkpoints that controlling the Palestinians' life. Now there is checkpoints is controlling the Palestinian products and moving in the areas between each other. There is no borders whatsoever with any country around the world. Everything is like controlled by Israel and has to pass through their procedures. So what we are having now is a real an apartheid system on the ground, that Israel controlling everything on it. And the rest of the West Bank, with the 60%, is under the settlers' ruling. And they are the masters in that areas, that they are controlling everything, launching the attacks on the Palestinians, dividing the rules between them and the Israeli military occupation and the Israeli government plans. Everyone is taking his part of the plan that aims at ethnically cleansing the Palestinians from that areas.
So if this is so clear-cut in your opinion, why hasn't the international community done anything to try and at least scale things back, if not stop the wall entirely?
Unfortunately, the international community, and I'm here talking about the official one, is supporting Israel. In spite of all what they are doing in the West Bank, it's against the international law, and it's violations for the basic human rights. And the whole humanitarian law and United Nations resolutions. In spite of that, they're still supporting Israel. They are still facilitating even the occupation, and they are participating in the occupation in the West Bank. Unfortunately, in spite of all what's going on in the West Bank and all these violations that they admit, the European Union, for example, is admitting these violations. In spite of this, they are upgrading their relation with Israel. They're signing new commercial agreements with Israel. That's unfortunate. That's like contradicting totally what they are talking about, from promoting peace in this area, from democratically in their own values, like encouraging this region to be. In what they are calling for, like having peace in this region, all what they are doing is totally contradicting this. It's just like make the situations much more difficult, is making the peace is impossible here, and promoting the bloodshed and war as Israel is deciding to be an apartheid state controlling Palestinian people forever, and launching attacks and wars on the neighbors, like on the Arabs, the neighbors, like in Lebanon, or threatening to attack Iran. Will burn the whole region.
But in the midst of all of this, Israel maintains this is a security concern, and they cannot operate unless there is some kind of security which this wall offers. What's the perspective on that from your end?
There is no whatsoever security that the wall is providing. This wall is just like promoting the violence. When people have been jailed and locked in 9 meters high wall, that controlling the Palestinian people and confiscating their land and separating them from their neighbors and relatives and from the world, this is what they think that will promote the violence, if they want to call it violence. Palestinians will not accept to live as slaves in this Bantustans and these ghettos that they are doing around the Palestinians. And they did these walls around Gaza in 2005. And Gaza has been encircled by not just wall after another, and security zone after another. What did this do? Did this prevent and provide for the Israel security? Security is not achieved by walls, not achieved by slaving people and controlling people and oppressing them. It's achieved by reconciliating with the people and getting back the right to the people, getting out the prisoners from their prisons, getting back the land that they confiscated, allow the Palestinian people for their self-determination and end their occupation. This is what brings the security. It's not in any way controlling more the people and solidifying their occupation here.
So do you think now it's gone too far, that the wall can actually be dismantled? Because a lot of money has been spent on this.
The wall is main part of the occupation now. We can't talk about dismantling the wall without dismantling the occupation. This is how Israel set the situation to be. They are hiding behind the wall now. And they want to make it a de facto borders that controlling the Palestinian people, not separating them from them, but controlling them and their life. And just dismantling the wall is dismantling the occupation. And Israel made it impossible for the Palestinians to have their own state, though the Palestinians will continue their struggle in order to get rid of the occupation and racism and the racial discrimination against them and against their people inside 48. And also, they will continue their struggle for the right of return for their people that they are, since now over 64 years, is scattered in the diaspora around the world. Palestinians will not give up these rights, and Israel can't hide behind the walls and pretend that they are working for their security. They are not working for their security. This is a colonial project that aiming and controlling the whole historical Palestine from the sea to the river, and controlling once and for all the Palestinian people in their land, locking them in reservations in the mountains of the West Bank.
All right, we're going to leave it there, Mr. Juma. That's Jamal Juma there from the campaign to stop the wall in Ramallah in the West Bank. More on that throughout the program, because this is an issue that's not going to go away. From 2002, it's been ongoing to now, 10 years of the apartheid wall. Well, for a slightly different take, civil society is doing what it can to draw attention to the plight of Palestinians in their quest for equality. Now, here's a roundup of just some of those activities in this week's Global Resistance.
Miko Peled hosted a conference in Seattle to launch his new book, The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. The son of an Israeli general and staunch Zionist, Peled has chosen to advocate for the other side. The launch raised much-needed awareness of the violent crimes committed against Palestinians and the blatant double standards employed by the Israelis. He also argued for a single secular state of Palestine that would accommodate all ethnic groups. His next point, which was imperative to the conference, was the Israeli army.
And then you've got the Israeli army, which I like to refer to as one of the best trained, best equipped, best fed terrorist organizations in the world.
Palestinians and international activists held a mass protest on the 443 highway to draw much-needed attention to the sharp increase in settler violence across the occupied territories. The demonstrators blocked the highway which connects Tel Aviv and Jerusalem through the West Bank. The highway has been built on Palestinian land, however it is illegal for Palestinians to use. The peaceful demonstration saw activists holding flags, banners and chants calling for an end to the occupation. The IDF intervened with unnecessary aggression, trying to move the protest along. They beat the activists with their guns, sprayed pepper spray in their eyes and threw grenades releasing gases, leaving the activists gasping for air. Palestinian Airlines flew for the first time again after 7 years of being grounded. It was in 2001 that Israel destroyed Gaza International Airport. Before its destruction, tens of thousands of travelers went through the airport from Gaza to various Middle Eastern destinations. Now, Palestinian Airlines, finally back on its tracks, is running a twice-weekly flight between Arish in Egypt and Jordan's capital, Amman.
My studio guest comes laden with credentials. He's the author of A Concise History of the Arabs, to be published next April by Saki, and he's been campaigning tirelessly to appeal to members of the European Parliament to vote against the pharmaceutical agreement between the EU and Israel. Well, sadly, the first round did not go as planned, but for the man who's the chair of the Liberal Democrats Friends of Palestine group, it's just the beginning, is it not, John McHugo? Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you very much.
So how did it go in the vote?
Well, I understand it went through by quite a large majority. I don't have the complete details. My concern has been with the members of the European Parliament from my own party, the Liberal Democrats. And I'm very proud to say that it is official Liberal Democrat Party policy that the EU-Israel Association Agreement should be suspended so long as the blockade of Gaza endures. Now that said, we have 12 MEPs, 8 of them followed the party line at our urging and voted against. So a clear majority of our MEPs did vote against this ACAA with Israel. Now, the problem that we have, I think, is in large sections of Western public opinion. I mean, Jamal Juma could not have been more eloquent in the way that he expressed the position, the international law obligations and so on. And that is what we have to draw to people's attention, and that way we will get them on our side. But the problem is we're basically up against a culture of denial. And when people are in denial about something, it's very difficult to shift the way they think. You have to say things to them very carefully, in a non-threatening kind of way. You have to understand their legitimate concerns. And that again brings me back to international law, because of course if you're going to recognise, if you're going to fight for the rights of one party, you can only do so by also recognising the other party's rights. And what is so mendacious about the expression peace process these days is that Israel says, we insist the Palestinians accept all our rights before we negotiate. But it will not accept Palestinian legitimate rights in international law at the same time.
Because this agreement was suspended for 2 years. After the Mavi Marmara, there was an outcry where people said, before we go any further with these discussions, there needs to be a couple of obligations met. Yes. That didn't happen, yet it was voted through.
Sorry, could I clarify slightly?
Yes, please.
The EU-Israel Association Agreement was not suspended. Mm-hmm. What this ACAA thing is, it's an agreement made further to that. And you're right, discussions on that were suspended for 2 years. And I'm afraid it's the old story. Time makes memories fade, makes memories telescope, people forget things. And, cast lead is, that was dreadful violence for 2 months. But since then, we've just had the normal, slow siege of Gaza. And eventually people thought, well, enough time's gone by, we can get this through. And I'm very sorry to say they were right.
What does it mean for trade?
It means the EU is in favour of free trade, and it's got its own big single market. And because Israel has a highly developed and very good pharmaceutical industry, what it means is that now Israeli pharmaceutical products, medicines and so on, will no longer need to be stopped at the borders of the EU to be tested to see whether they comply with EU standards. Instead, Israeli standards, which are acceptable to the EU, will be applied, and therefore they will be able to come into the EU without further testing. And what this does in effect is it gives Israel trade preference over other countries that do not have an ACAA. That is what it does. But my big worry about it, and this actually could turn out to be a blessing in disguise, is knowing the way Israel behaves. The EU says this only applies to products made in Israel before the 1967 armistice lines.
So what about settlement products?
Precisely. Israel will do its damnedest. I will bet my boots on that. Israel will do its damnedest to incorporate ingredients, products, labour from settlements and bring it into the EU. Now, the EU is officially opposed to that. But as I see things at the moment, the EU has no proper mechanism to ensure that that doesn't happen. And maybe that will give us the opportunity to make our case once again and clamp down on settlement imports, and maybe even get to the position, this is what I would like to do, make the onus on Israel to prove that it is not using settlement products in this way. But, that's going to be a long struggle.
Is there room for more of a fight here, or have you got to concede this round at least?
Well, it depends what you mean by a fight. I mean,
because you say you're going to observe and then, you know, strike at the earliest opportunity when perhaps there have been meanderings or people have come away from what they ought to be doing. But you can't stop this process now, can you?
Well, as I said, we believe in international law. The Liberal Democrats are the party of internationalism and of international law. And part of that means, of course, that when you have the EU Parliament ratifying this agreement and it becomes EU law, we have to accept that that's the law. And so our struggle now becomes, can we change the law? Can we interpret it? And here Israel does have a little bit of a weakness because there is growing hostility. I mean, even, you know, many people who would describe themselves as true friends of Israel are very, very uneasy about the whole settlement enterprise. Almost everyone, well, everyone who's at all objective recognises that the settlements are illegal in international law. They ought never to have been put there. And I think this gives us a little ray of hope that we can fight to persuade, to make sure that the EU does not let settlement products come in. And if we succeed in that, Israel will be very, very angry about it, because the Israeli government's whole case for trying to, as that Catholic priest you interviewed,
is to take over.
It wants Palestine or Israel, Eretz Israel, from the river to the sea.
We leave it there, John Hugo. He's, of course, the chair of the Liberal Democrats, Friends of Palestine, and we will revisit this topic, so very important. And we go quickly to today's poetic contribution, which again comes from Ibrahim Sincere. This one is called Souls of the Lost.
Don't we all believe that we are strong people? Should tragedy